About probably 8 years ago, just soon after I became blind, I remember visiting a church where someone was giving a testimony about a recent mission trip that they went on. And they shared this story about how they had prayed for somebody who was blind in this village where they had been, and that person had been suddenly healed. And it was this incredible moment of just miraculous healing. And I felt terrible. I just kind of walked to the back of the room and cried and felt like, how could God heal somebody in some part of the world with just a single prayer when I have been asking for years and years for God to heal me from my blindness? And I think that's such a complicated feeling, of course. Like there's part of me that wants to be able to rejoice in these healings and finds hope in that. And then part of me who is just so envious that anyone else could receive this while I haven't. But just a few days ago, actually, I was on the bus on the way to church, and the group of women came up to me and asked if they could pray for me. And they prayed for healing for me and for God's blessing on me. And I was really struck just thinking about this experience compared to the experience I had 8 years ago and how differently I processed it, because I could say amen along with these women, because I actually believe that I have experienced so much healing in my disability. And actually through my disability that I've experienced the healing of contentment and the healing of true security in my identity as God's child, and so many things aside from my physical healing. And I am so convinced that one day when I see Jesus, I'm going to see him clearly. I just am really grateful to think about how God has given me that answer to a lot of my prayers, just in contentment and presence with him.
Hi everyone, welcome back to the Overtones podcast. I'm Joe and I'm here today with my co-hosts LaRae and Christy.
Hi everyone.
Hello there. If you're new to the podcast, our goal is to investigate and celebrate the diverse unity of the Christian church around the world.
That's right. We speak to academics, church workers, and lay people from across the global church in order to highlight lesser heard voices and grow in our love for our brothers and sisters around the world.
Today, we're delighted to have with us on the podcast Amberly Brown, who's here to help us think about her experience of disability and the church. Thanks so much for being with us, Amberly.
Thank you guys for having me.
Amberly, lots of people on the podcast won't have ever met you before, so could you please tell us a bit about yourself?
Yeah, well, I'll kind of start with the beginning of my life story. I was born in the US, and when I was 7 years old, I grew up in a Christian home. When I was 7 years old, I told my parents that when I grew up, I wanted to be a missionary. And so from a very young age, I had this kind of calling of being a missionary to an unreached people group, or a people group where very few Indigenous members had heard the gospel. I kind of had this really single-minded focus to pursuing that. I had this whole plan of how I was going to become a missionary nurse and use that kind of profession as a way to care for people and share the good news about Jesus. And then when I was 21 years old, just finishing nursing school, I had a rare autoimmune reaction to medication called toxic epidermal nephrolysis. And I ended up in a hospital in a medically induced coma for over a month. And I nearly died, but thanks to God, I'm here today. But when I woke up from that coma and I was released from the hospital, I could no longer see. So at that point, I could see kind of shadows and color, but no detail. So I couldn't see facial features or words or anything like that. And so I experienced a real identity crisis at that moment, because I felt like I had put all of my identity into this calling that I had to be a missionary. And I felt like now that I had a disability, that I couldn't fulfill that calling anymore. And I didn't know what my purpose was in life.
Wow.
But a few years after that, I met a missionary actually who told me that people with disabilities, if they were counted as a single people group, would be the largest unreached people group in the world. So there's a billion people in the world with disabilities, and
Wow.
only 5 to 10% of them are estimated to have ever heard the gospel.
Oh my, that's shocking. Okay.
It is amazing. And so I kind of had this transformational moment where I realized God gave me not only this aspiration to reach an unreached people group, but now he had actually also given me membership in an unreached people group. And so
Wow.
I felt like that is my life purpose, to bring the love of God to people with disabilities. And I've had the great joy over the past 11 years of being blind, of getting to work with churches. I started an organization called the Banquet Network that works with churches to help them include people with disabilities, and also work with Compassion International, a Christian charity that works in Latin America, Asia, and Africa with local churches. And I among other things, help with our disability inclusion work there. So it's been quite a journey and a ride, but that's where I am today.
That's incredible.
That's so cool. Thanks so much for sharing, Amberly.
You said it was like an identity crisis. I think it was, and in some way, what you just described is almost like a kind of incarnation, isn't it?
Yeah.
And then it almost kind of help you see God's purpose in your life a bit more, which I thought was beautiful. It was a form of suffering, and it was kind of, we look for it one day. It's kind of similar experience will not happen when we see the Lord. But still, the way you were empowered to see God's design and the beauty in this, and to kind of reclaim that calling that you have always kind of nurtured. Thank you so much for sharing. That was so beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we all want the resurrection, but we don't want the crucifixion that comes before it.
Right.
Very well said.
Right.
Very well said. Well, I certainly, try my best to avoid all forms of suffering.
Yeah. We've gotten that down to a pretty good science in the modern West, huh?
Yes, that's so true.
Amberly, before we kind of get stuck in, we'd love you to help us with language regarding disabilities, because often I think as people without disabilities, it might be difficult to figure out kind of how to describe people with disabilities or what language to use, and it could feel like we're avoiding lots of big potholes. Could you help us with that before we get going?
I will say there's lots of different opinions and preferences, certainly in different countries and places, but even between people, individuals in the same place, they might have different preferences. So I would always say it's okay to ask what people prefer. Lots of people still prefer people first language. So talking about a person with a disability or a woman who's blind. But there are definitely people now, and especially in the disability advocacy space, who have really embraced the disability first language. So who are really proud to own these labels of a disabled person, or a blind woman or something like that. So it's generally okay to ask. I think that's a big thing, is that sometimes we're so afraid to ask that we just won't even engage. And that's a real tragedy, because there's no reason for fear to keep us from even engaging in conversation. Ultimately, I always say, like, the best solution is to get to know the person and find out their names, so you don't have to use any other descriptors besides their name.
That's really helpful.
Do you feel like over these past 8 years, the way you relate to people changed because of your disability at church or outside of church? Do you think people related to you differently?
Well, I'll say I definitely see people differently and value different things in people than I did before. I think now I feel a real empathy and solidarity with other people with disabilities that I definitely didn't experience before, and I'm really grateful for that. I am so grateful for just the thoughtfulness of individuals who are, even think about what an experience of blindness might be like, and think like, maybe it would be nice if I just said who I was when I came up to this person, or describe what's going on. I've really appreciated that in people, but I've definitely found it isolating, because you can be in a room full of friends and just not know that you know anyone around you. And so I've had a lot of challenges around just like being with people and feeling like fully included in groups, because most of the world is just not made for people with disabilities. It assumes lots of abilities, and that's how our environments are created. And I think that's the thing about the definition of disability that we have actually is not just, it's not just about the functional impairment. Like, it's not just about me not being able to see. It's actually also about the environment not being built for people who can't see, because there are places like in my home where I don't operate with much disability because it's set up for me.
Sure.
But yeah, often churches are definitely not places that are set up for people with disabilities. Even being able to participate in kind of call and response prayer, or, you know, reading lyrics on a page or on a screen, those kinds of things. It's absolutely given me a new appreciation for what the experience of people who aren't kind of in the mainstream, even people who are illiterate or people who have all kinds of different experiences. The whole church is really just set up for the average, and that's the challenge.
Yes. So what would you say to churches that are wanting to grow their disability outreach and inclusion? Where would you suggest they start? And what kind of advice would you give?
Well, first of all, I would just say praise God, because that's amazing. I'm so glad that you're thinking about people with disabilities. Lots of people without disabilities can go through their entire lives not really considering or thinking about disability. And yet, when we read the Gospels, you can't read through a gospel without encountering disability. There's so much disability in the Bible and in Jesus's life. And so praise God for you taking that step and being intentional. I think the number one pitfall that I would say that churches have in disability inclusion is just thinking that it requires a specialist, or that you have to be kind of a niche ministry or have some very specific calling to disability in order to do anything about it. Like, it's something that needs to be left to those big churches that have people who are dedicated to this cause. That's really not true. Like I said, a fifth of the population in the world has a disability. And so there's no way that that large proportion of the population is going to be reached by the gospel and invited into the family of God if every church doesn't do something to include people with disabilities. So the second thing I kind of see a lot that would be a pitfall is really setting aside disability ministry as this separate ministry that maybe you have a few people in a room in the side of the church or something, that you have really a specialized, not mainstreamed ministry for them. You know, of course, that's a step. It's better than nothing, but I love that 1 Corinthians 12:22 says the parts of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable. I think if we aren't including these parts of the body that seem to be weak, which people with disabilities are definitely considered weak in the world's standards, if we're not including them, then we're missing out as a church. You know, the body of Christ is missing this indispensable part. And so we know that people with disabilities are made in the image of God and have a vocation and gifts that God has given them to share with the church. And so I would say, yeah, the goal is to have people with disabilities fully embraced in the church, and actually not just being recipients of ministry, but even being people who are sharing their own gifts with others in the church.
That's wonderful. I can speak to my experience, a little bit of that in my own church, where we have several different people with various disabilities that are they're the most consistent on the tea and coffee rota and serving in the nursery and all sorts of things. And it's so challenging to me and such an encouragement. I just can't imagine them not being fully involved. And we do benefit so much from their service. Do you sense often a bit of fear among churches, or maybe even more broadly, just people without disabilities, of saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing and then just not doing anything out of that sense of fear? And if so, what would you say to that?
Yeah, for sure. I think in all the world, not just the church, that can be one of the biggest barriers to really valuing people with disabilities and even getting to know people with disabilities. It's just a fear of offending someone, or fear of doing the wrong thing, fear of being embarrassed or uncomfortable. I think those are huge barriers to true inclusion and real engagement with people with disabilities. I would just say that perfect love is promised to cast out fear. And so whatever fear that we experience, that I experience in that, Jesus's love demonstrates going beyond or through our fears to engage with things that are difficult or uncomfortable. And I think it's a really important part of being a Christian, is to not listen to fear, to listen to the voice of love instead, and just to engage. And I think there's grace. We all make mistakes. We all do the wrong things sometimes, and we all feel uncomfortable sometimes. And this is worth it, because as a person with disability, it can feel like all people are is afraid of you or afraid of engaging with you. And so if you, as somebody without a disability, take the chance to be afraid and just do it anyways for once, it's almost like entering into that experience with somebody with a disability that they experience so often, but they don't get a choice of if they have to be in that situation. So you get to choose that to enter in there.
That's so beautiful. Thank you, Amberly. That's a really helpful picture.
Emily, you mentioned that part of what you do now is helping churches and helping outreach with people with disabilities with the gospel. Can you tell us a bit more about what that looks like for you?
Yeah. So we started a small charity called the Banquet Network that helps churches to start to include people with disabilities. And we've got a startup workshop that we take churches through as they're beginning. So we get to walk with churches through the planning phase and the implementation of their unique individualized plans. I think what I love to tell people about starting disability ministry is that you already have things in place to start with. It may feel really foreign or new to you, but actually there are things that you can work with right now in your church. So start with what you've already got. There may be people already in your congregation or in your community who have disabilities, maybe, or you may or may not know that they have disabilities, but if you start talking about it, then it tends to come out. So take a look at who's in your congregation and what they need. As I said about fear, sometimes we're so afraid to just ask questions, but that's what's really standing between us and better inclusion. Ask what they need to be able to have a better experience or to participate more fully in your church, what gifts they have.
Yes.
And then it's estimated that 1 in 4 households has somebody with a disability in it. And so there's likely even people in your church who have people with disabilities in their families or that they know in their neighborhoods who aren't attending church or feel like they can't. Maybe they feel like they'd be unwelcome, or maybe they just haven't ever been invited because they've thought it was too inconvenient or something. So let people know that you want them to invite the people that they know, no matter what their abilities are, and that you'll work with them to help them to be able to visit and attend and participate in your church life. And then there's also lots of disability organizations out in the world, in our communities. And this is also a great way to get started, just to start getting to know some of these other disability organizations, asking how you can serve them or the people that attend their programming, and then inviting those people to outreach events that you have at your church.
Can I ask a quick follow-up question on that? Have you been able to work quite a bit with secular disability charities? And if so, kind of what have been the good things and helpful things about that, or have there been challenges? Yeah, I'm just curious.
Yeah, I definitely have gotten to volunteer with or work with secular organizations, and I know lots of other churches who partner with secular disability organizations. I thought it was so insightful. One of the disability housing organizations that we worked with at my prior church told us, we can provide all of these services to these people, but we can't provide them with friendship. And so that's the number one thing that
Wow.
we would like you all to help with. So we actually got to once a week, our small group would go over to this house and bring games and snacks and just hang out and become friends. And actually one of those people who lived at that house started coming to church with us and got baptized, and we just had a
wow.
wonderful friendship with him. So
Mm.
I think
That's
it's
beautiful.
actually amazing how open some of these secular organizations are to partnering with churches, because there's so much value in that relationship that the church can bring.
That's brilliant.
Yeah, I think that's a really wonderful picture of the gospel as something that it extends true relationship, true life between people in a community that is united. So that's great. One new relationship that you've made is your son, Atlas, who I've had the privilege of looking after on a Thursday morning at Crash over the past year, and it's been lots of fun. How have you found Atlas being in your life the last year and a half, and how's your kind of experience of disability also shifted as you've become a parent?
I would say becoming a parent with a disability was really scary. I think my husband and I waited quite a while to have our first child, and I think that was a big reason why.
Mm.
There's all kinds of fears there, the perceptions about parents with disabilities, and then just the practical realities of caring for a child. But I really have found, again, like we so often want to cling to our strengths and our identity and our strengths. And I've found, like, being a parent, you actually don't get to cling to your strengths. No one does. I don't think it exposes so many of your weaknesses. And just having a disability, I've definitely had to come face to face with my inadequacies and shortcomings, but also just with so much grace. And I love being able to raise him as somebody who doesn't see disability as not normal or as odd. Another blind mom told me when I was pregnant, he's never gonna think your parenting is deficient because you're the only mom he's ever gonna know. So I found a lot of encouragement just in knowing, like, who we are is both our strengths and our weaknesses, and that's a gift that both of those things can bring blessing.
Mm-hmm.
That's beautiful. I'm sure every parent could relate to that at different levels, but yes.
A couple of things that you touched on I thought was really helpful, and I think one thing is the invisibility of disability. And sometimes I think it's not one of those so-called minorities in church, but I think what you just touched on is an issue that really just kind of go across the board to all kinds of different people, different experiences. It is this recognition of diversity and how to approach diversity with love and a willingness to understand and engage. And the fear that we have when we see things or people who are different from us. And I think once we kind of recognize and appreciate this diversity and see differences in people, it's not just weaknesses or perceived weaknesses that we see, but also unique strengths and abilities. So I just wonder, Emily, would you say, over the course of kind of 11 years of this kind of experience of being someone who's blind, what do you think would be the strengths and ability that you think you acquire that you could really serve the church, and that has, things that have encouraged you is because of the person that you've become?
Wow, I have become such a different person. It's hard to know where to start, but I think first of all, I'm definitely more empathetic, and I think I can see things from a different perspective now. And that is probably the thing I've gotten to use the most, in just being able to advise and help churches that are trying to think about how to become more disability inclusive, being able to really kind of think about the experiences that different people might have in their participation in church. That's been a real gift, just to have that perspective. And then I would say my joy was pretty surface level. Like, I was a very social butterfly, moved from here to there, and now I have a much better ability to like engage deeply and sustain relationship and not shy away from the more difficult things or stories because I've been forced to engage constantly with mine, and being more deeply engaged in people's lives has also been a huge gift.
Thank you.
So, Amberly, you, over the course of maybe the past couple of years, you've made a big transition in moving from Texas to the UK. And so you've been now involved in two very different church cultures, I would assume. And I wonder if that experience of these different cultures has brought any new reflections, either on differences in how people of differing abilities are perceived in the US versus the UK, or maybe perspectives that transcend those different cultures.
Yeah, that's a great question. This reminds me of, I think, the first time that we helped in the toddler class at church. We were completely shocked because the toddlers kind of came into the room and they just sat quietly on their little circles and waited for class to start. And I thought, what are these British children? What are these British children made of? Because this could never happen in my church back home.
That's incredible.
So yeah, different cultures. But that actually kind of underscores one of the things that I feel like I've experienced in the UK is just there is a real, in some ways it's a great thing, like in those toddlers, it's quite impressive, but there's a real social pressure to behave well and kind of for this decorum. And I found that, I think, even myself, but especially even bringing other friends with disabilities along, I think that's one of the things that is a bit nerve-wracking in any church. I would say that definitely happens in the US as well, but I think there's a bit of a notched a little bit higher in some contexts here, just that real emphasis on decorum, proper behavior. So I would say that's something. I don't know how a British person with a disability would experience that or respond to that. I think for me, myself, it's definitely made me feel a little more nervous about doing the wrong thing or, walking the wrong place or something. But that's one thing that's been kind of emphasized here. I think that there's always people who are so kind in all cultures that you'll go to, and that might look different in different cultures. But there was a study in the US of parents of children with special needs, and 90% of them said that the most important support for their child to be included at church was just a welcoming attitude.
Wow.
I think a welcoming attitude is going to look different here than it does in Texas, but we all have the capacity for that, to be welcoming and to just take that 2 seconds to smile at a family or to tell someone you're glad that they came, and because that can make a huge difference. And that's been something I've experienced in both places, but I think there's unique ways of doing that.
That makes a lot of sense.
Joe, what do you think, being the only British person here?
I'll keep my upper lip stiff. I didn't say anything. No, I think that's really helpful. I think all cultures have blind spots, and all cultures can learn from different cultures. And I think that is probably a place where a lot of Brits just find difficult and awkward, and sometimes just need to be kind of goaded into just not goaded. That's the wrong word.
Nudged.
But just kind of pricked in the backside every now and again to go, nudged to open up a bit. And I think especially with relationships, especially with relationships in the church, it can be very kind of surface level. And as we've talked about getting to know people, especially with those with disabilities, it can be difficult and can be very afraid of crossing a boundary or going to chat to somebody because they're kind of the fear of offending somebody. But we have a gospel where we have forgiveness. We're also compelled to kindness and gentleness, but relationships that cross all sorts of boundaries. And so we have a great reason to. So, yeah.
Cultures need to be redeemed as well,
Yes.
right? Like, Christianity does kind of enter culture and challenge it. And every culture is unique. So then British churches, but also all churches, could be a little bit more kind of courageous and sensitive, because it's overcome that fear to reach out to people that are just a little bit more different from you. I think that reminds me of how important it is to be welcoming to people who are foreigners.
Yes.
Yeah, and the great thing about that is that anybody can do it. You don't have to be a pastor or a staff or something to be
Mm.
the person who makes a difference in someone's experience by going and being welcoming.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah.
Do you have anything else to say, Amberly, to those of us who aren't necessarily leaders in the church? Maybe we can't lead an outreach program necessarily in church, but just kind of regular lay members of the church who, as you say, probably know someone with a disability or know a family that has disability in it. How can we love our brothers and sisters of diverse abilities better?
Yeah. I mean, of course, prayer is one of the best things that all of us can do, just to pray for the disability community, for the gospel to reach people with disabilities, and for people with disabilities to be embraced and valued in the church. And also just to pray for our churches, because so many of our churches are lacking this indispensable part. And so we're actually, we may not know it, but we're hurting because of the exclusion of people with disabilities, I believe. Welcoming people, just being a smiling face rather than a scowling or staring face when somebody comes in with a disability, or even if somebody at your church is making noise or something like that, just to reassure or be kind rather than staring or being annoyed. Yeah, inviting people, of course, if you know anyone with a disability, and talking to them beforehand about, or to their family member about what they would need to make their experience positive. And then, yeah, friendship, just getting to know people. That's the biggest thing. I think 2/3 of people with disabilities are chronically lonely. So there's just a huge epidemic of isolation in general, but especially in the disability community. And especially among young people with disabilities, there's an even higher proportion of them that are chronically lonely. And so to meet someone with a disability, getting to know them, engaging with them, visiting their home if they have a hard time getting out, that can make such a huge difference in the lives of people with disabilities.
I can imagine some people listening, we might be thinking, oh, well, I can't really sympathize with people who have disabilities. How am I supposed to help them? Or how am I supposed to love them? Or how can I do that well, even when I can't fully understand? And I guess your answer, correct me if I'm wrong, is just get alongside them, get to know them, be a good friend, be a listening ear, be an encouraging voice, and just do life together. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, I think relationship is 100% the most transformative thing for disability. So definitely getting to know each other. I think also remember that all of us do have deficits and weaknesses. Some of us might be able to hide ours better, compensate, or maybe the world is kind of designed a bit more for those weaknesses, but there are things in your life that you can't do on your own and that you need help with. So maybe there are ways you can empathize that with somebody with a disability, even if it feels more common, your weakness, than theirs.
That's really helpful.
Are there things that you think would be good for us to be reminded of? Things that we are not supposed to do or say, like language that the church very often use, either from the front or just within the community, or mistakes, or just kind of like negligence that you can think of that you want to highlight?
I think the biggest thing I would say to the church is just to remember that all people are holistic people. People with disabilities aren't just their disability. And so I know, some churches might see me or see somebody with a disability, and whether or not it's conscious, I may feel treated like I'm just somebody to be healed or display for people to see a miracle in, rather than a whole person. I do need healing in lots of ways, but I also, I also have gifts of the Spirit and joys and things as well. So
thank you, Emily. I think what you said was so important. I think it applies to not just people who are blind, kind of visually impaired, but like really all people with their own unique situations and circumstances. And I think as a church, we are supposed to do better than people who don't know the gospel. We are called to be empathetic, compassionate, and not just that, but to really have the willingness to engage in other people's lives, even if it means it gets a bit messier, because we are going to enjoy some kind of intimacy and real fellowship. We do want to share each other's lives and think from another person's perspective. It's hard to do, but if we are not doing any better than other communities, or even doing worse than other communities, then there are things to repent for.
Yes. Amberly, is there anything about the gospel that has become maybe especially precious to you in your experience of disability?
Wow, there are so many things. There's a great book actually by, I think it's Michael Beetz, on the disability in the gospel. I definitely recommend for people who are interested in this question. There's so many things. I love that Jesus took on weakness and suffering. I love that even in his crucifixion, he experienced his disability. He was blindfolded, he was immobilized, all of these disorienting experiences he had. And I love that he went out of his way to reach people with disabilities and people who would have been blocked from him. My favorite story in the Gospels is in Luke 14 with the parable of the banquet, and it ends with this command that Jesus tells his followers: when you throw a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed. And I love that because he actually commanded us, when we're gathering people, don't overlook those people who are typically not invited or who are excluded. And I love that in this parable, there's this image of his upside down kingdom where the people who are poor, crippled, lame, and blind are invited into the banquet. These are the ones who actually get to celebrate with the master. And then the ones who are distracted by comfort and success, they don't come to the banquet. They're left outside. Yeah, which is so counter to kind of our ideas. And Jesus says that there will be those who invite those people to the banquet will be blessed, but there'll be blessing at the resurrection of the righteous for inviting those who are usually excluded. So I think there's so much that we have to learn from Jesus on the priority of inclusion.
And like you said before, the poor and the lame and the crippled and the blind, they're not invited to a separate table that's kind of set aside for them, but they're invited to the banquet and completely included, which, not that there's never a place for specialized ministry, but I think the overall goal, like you were saying early on in the episode, is full inclusion and integration. Yeah, that's the word I'm looking for.
Emily, thanks so much of that reminder of our Lord Jesus, the one who kind of goes out of his way to reach everybody. You mentioned right at the beginning, there's this encounter with Jesus that particularly resonated with you. Could you tell us a bit about that to finish?
Yeah, there are so many stories about disability in the Gospels, but there's one that I really love, which is in Mark 8, and it's about this man who is blind and who Jesus encounters. So he comes to him and Jesus touches him once, and he asks the man, "What do you see?" And he says, "I see men, but they look like trees walking around." And I love this story because this is exactly my experience. Like, when I see people, they could be trees, they could be people. I've definitely talked to trees before.
Oh,
I just resonate so much with this man. But then Jesus touches him again and he's fully healed, and it says he can see clearly. And I love this story because not only I resonate with the experience of this man, like I am in that middle place where I've been, partially healed, but I'm still waiting for the day when I'll see clearly. But I also think this is a great metaphor for all of us as Christians, because we're all in this world living in an in-between where we're no longer in darkness. Jesus has brought us into the light of his salvation, but none of us are fully healed. We're all living with brokenness in this world, and we're all waiting for that day when Jesus will touch us again and we'll be fully restored. It's just a great reminder that any healing that happens on earth, any healing, what if I was healed tomorrow, it would be temporary and it would be partial. The only full true healing that all of us will experience is going to come when Jesus returns, and that is going to be a great day. but Jesus is still with us in the middle, in that moment. He asks us, what do we see? We see trees, men who look like trees walking around, but he's still there. He's still here in the middle, in that blurry in between.
Beautiful.
Thanks so much, Amberly. Thanks so much for sharing your experience with us and this time together. We'll make sure that that book is referenced either in the description or there's a link to it. So please check that out. And yeah, thank you for that wonderful reminder that as one body, we all matter and Jesus cares about every single part. And he's there, he's always there, wanting to draw us in, no matter kind of where we are and who we are. He loves us. And thanks so much, Amberly, for that. And we look forward to you listeners joining us again next week for another episode of the Overtones podcast. So until then, thanks and goodbye. Thanks for tuning into the Overtones podcast today. Make sure to subscribe and tune in to the next episode on your streaming platform of choice.
Follow us and share our podcast with your friends on Facebook and Instagram. You can find us on both platforms as Overtones Think Tank.
And if you'd like to get in touch with feedback, comments, or other ideas, our email address is podcast@overtonesproject.com. See you next week.